12-Mile Bay, Georgian Bay, Ontario. The third week of August, 1957. 8:30 in the evening. Eleanor Fenwick, 41, out of Toronto, stood on the granite shelf above her family's dock and struck a match against the housing of a coal oil lamp her husband's father had carried out to this island by mailboat in 1934. Behind her, the cabin's windows were still dark. Half a mile across open water, a single point of firelight had appeared on the next inhabited island, for the first time in 4 days. She counted it before she counted the woodpile, before the children, before the kettle just starting to sing on the stove behind her. Someone was home again. That was not a fact Eleanor Fenwick had been taught in any deliberate way. It was something the bay itself had taught her, 1 August at a time, since she had first come out to this island as a bride 11 summers earlier, that a light on a neighbouring shore, at this hour, on this water, was not scenery. It was information. It meant a family she had not seen since the previous September had made the crossing safely, that their boat was tied up, that the particular quiet the Fenwicks lived inside all week had, for tonight, a second point of light keeping it company. Below her, she could hear her son Alistair's canoe before she could see it, the specific, uneven rhythm of a 13-year-old paddling too fast on the return leg, eager to report that he had seen the neighbouring family's boat come in. Her daughter Joan sat behind him, trailing one hand in the water the way she had been told, more than once, not to. Douglas, Eleanor's husband, was still 40 minutes out on the mailboat run to collect the week's post and the flour they had ordered, a crossing he made now instead of Eleanor, because the wind had begun, an hour earlier, to move in a direction that made her uneasy. None of this, the counted light, the recognized paddle stroke, the specific quality of wind that sent her husband out instead of letting the errand wait, had a name in any book Eleanor Fenwick owned. It was simply what an island asked of the people who lived on it for 10 weeks a year, and had been asking of families like hers since the first Toronto households began building out here, boat access only, granite to the waterline, 4 decades earlier. What exactly had this island taught Eleanor Fenwick to listen for? In a paddle stroke, in a shift of wind, in a single distant fire, that 11 summers in a city house had never once required her to know. To understand what Eleanor Fenwick was actually listening for, you need to understand what an island cottage in the 30,000 islands required that a mainland cottage did not. There was no road to this island, and there had never been one. Regional cottage histories of Go Home Bay and 12-Mile Bay describe a cottage economy built entirely around water, cottages reached only by boat, mail and groceries delivered by dedicated mail and supply boats that made their rounds through the summer months. Cottagers meeting the boat at a dockside mail shed where cubbyholes were labeled, 1 per family, and a missed delivery day meant a missed delivery, full stop. A family like the Fenwicks did not simply decide to live differently out here. The water decided for them. This is the part of island cottage life that no brochure needed to explain, and every family that lived it understood without discussion. Everything that arrived by water, and everything that went wrong had to be solved, for the length of a crossing, by the people already on the island. There was no telephone line strung out under the bay. Regional accounts of Georgian Bay's island cottage country note that a great many of these properties never received central hydroelectric service at all, not in the 1950s, and for some, not decades later, because running cable under open water to a scattered archipelago was neither simple nor, for most families, worth the cost. Coal oil lamps, ice boxes, and later small generators were not a rustic choice. They were the terms of living somewhere the grid had never been asked to reach. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Canadian cottage and campfire summer between 1920 and 1980. What the cabin was, What the campfire or the fishing trip or the dock conversation gave the family who kept the ritual, and what they were actually building when they came back to the same lake or the same island, summer after summer. Not nostalgia for old photographs, the documented social meaning of a ritual that a generation of Canadian families arranged their year around. Even if you never spent a summer on an island, this is a story about what real distance, from help, from neighbors, from anything but your own family, actually asked of the people living inside it. And if you spent your summers at a lake or an island like this, or your family did, put it in the comments. If you spent summers on a boat access island anywhere in Canada, what's the first sound you learned to tell apart on the water? Next, we go west to the rented lakeside camps of British Columbia, where families never owned a single board of the cabin and came back anyway, the same week, for 40 years. Back to the fire. What island isolation actually did to a family like the Fenwicks was not what a city relative might imagine. It did not thin family life out, it concentrated it. On the mainland, in a lake cottage reachable by car, an evening could be interrupted. A neighbor's visit, a drive into town, a radio program from a station strong enough to reach the shore. On an island half a mile from the next inhabited shore, an evening had almost nothing else competing with it. By the time Douglas's boat came in from the mail run that night, the wind having settled exactly as Eleanor had hoped it would, there was only one thing left to do before dark: build the fire in the ring of stones on the granite shelf above the dock, and let the whole family sit inside the one circle of light on the island. This was not a fire built for warmth. August evenings on the bay rarely required one. It was built because a family with nowhere else to go, and no one else arriving that night, needed a specific object to sit around, something that gave the evening a shape, a center, a reason for four people to stay in the same place, doing the same slow, wordless thing, instead of drifting to four separate corners of a cabin that had, after all, no electric light to read by once the sun was fully down. Alistair fed driftwood in, with more enthusiasm than technique. Joan sat close enough to her mother that their shoulders touched. Douglas said almost nothing for the first 20 minutes, the specific silence of a man who had just crossed open water in a changing wind and was only now allowing himself to stop paying attention to it. What was a family on a granite island, half a mile from its nearest neighbor, actually building around that fire that a family with a road out and a telephone line never had quite the same reason to build? There was a specific ritual the Fenwicks performed almost without noticing they performed it, and regional oral histories of Georgian Bay's island cottage families describe versions of the same habit up and down the archipelago. Before anyone went to bed, someone walked to the edge of the rock and looked out across the water, counting the lights. Not out of worry, most nights, out of a kind of bookkeeping that only made sense on an island, a mental ledger of which neighboring cottages were occupied that week, which families had come out, which fires were lit. A distant point of firelight on another island was never just scenery to the people who lived among these islands. It was a message with no words attached to it, sent by people who had no other way to send one. We're here too. You are not as alone on this water as the dark makes it feel. Eleanor had explained this once to a cousin visiting from the city, who had asked, not unkindly, whether it wasn't lonely out here, miles from a proper road, with the nearest neighbor a boat ride away. She hadn't quite had the words for it then. What she meant, and what she came closer to understanding every summer, was that the loneliness a city person imagined and the isolation an island family actually lived inside were not the same thing at all. A family alone on an island for a week did not stop being watched over. They simply changed what watching over looked like. A fire seen and counted across open water, in place of a knock at the door. Documented Cottage Association records from comparable Georgian Bay lake and island communities describe an informal but real emergency network built entirely on this visibility. In a crisis, the nearest neighbor, Even one who could only be reached by boat, was typically no more than 10 minutes away by water, closer, in practice, than many mainland cottage families were to the nearest doctor by road. The isolation was real, so was the community built specifically to answer it. What did it mean for a mother standing on a dark granite shelf, counting firelight instead of streetlights, to understand her family's safety in terms of who could reach her by water in 10 minutes, rather than who lived next door? For the Fenwick children, the island was not a place they visited. It was, for 10 weeks of the year, the entire world, and the entire world had rules that a city child's world did not. Alistair had learned, by the summer he turned 10, to tell his father's outboard motor apart from every other boat on the bay before it ever came into view around the point. Not by sight, which was impossible from inside the cottage, but by the specific pitch of the engine, the particular unevenness in its idle that no other motor on the water quite matched. This was not a skill anyone had set out to teach him. It had simply accumulated, the way a city child accumulates the sound of a parent's specific footstep on a specific stair, except that here the distance was open water instead of a hallway, and the stakes of misreading it were, on certain days, considerably higher. Regional accounts of island cottage childhoods described this precise pattern repeatedly. Children who grew up on Georgian Bay's islands learned the sound signature of every family boat within a mile of their own before they learned to swim across the bay that separated them. The whole island, in a way no city child's yard or street ever quite was, belonged to them. Every rock, every landing spot, every safe channel between shoals memorized by 9 or 10 years old, because there was no one else's property line to learn instead. A child on this island did not ask permission to explore it. The island's entire boundary was the water, and the water's rules were the only rules that mattered. What Alistair Fenwick was actually building, boat sound by boat sound, summer by summer, was not a party trick. It was the specific, practical vocabulary of a child, raised somewhere that required him to know, before anyone told him, exactly who was coming, and exactly how much that mattered. To understand why the Fenwicks, and families like them, chose an island with no road over a mainland cottage with one, you need to understand what this particular stretch of granite and pine had already come to mean in the Canadian imagination by the 1950s. Documented art history confirms that painters who would become known as the Group of Seven, Tom Thompson, J.E.H. MacDonald, Arthur Lismer, A.Y. Jackson among them, worked extensively through the 30,000 islands in the 1910s and 1920s, traveling out by train decades before any road reached this stretch of coast. What they painted, repeatedly, was exactly the combination the Fenwicks woke up to every August morning: wind-bent pine, rooted directly into bare pink granite, water on every side, a landscape with almost nothing soft or cultivated in it. By the time Eleanor and Douglas Fenwick were choosing where to spend their summers, that image was no longer simply scenery. It had become, through gallery walls and school art lessons, something close to a national visual signature, and a family who owned a piece of that specific granite and pine geography was staking a claim to something more than a cottage. This created a distinct social geography within Canadian cottage country itself. A mainland cottage in Muskoka, reachable eventually by car and, later, by paved road, represented one kind of family investment: convenience, proximity, a place easy to bring friends to on a weekend. An island cottage in the 30,000 islands. Boat access only, no telephone, no guaranteed hydro, represented something closer to a deliberate choice of difficulty. A family saying, in effect, that ease was not actually the point. Douglas Fenwick's father had understood this when he first brought the family's own boat and building lumber out to this island in the 1930s, at a cost and inconvenience a Muskoka cottage would never have required. He was not choosing hardship for its own sake. He was choosing the specific, harder-won kind of family life that only an island, with all its counted fires and recognized engines and 10-minute neighbors, actually made possible. The limitation underneath all of this, the one Eleanor Fenwick rarely spoke of directly, even to Douglas, was weather. Documented marine safety records for Georgian Bay describe conditions on this stretch of open water as genuinely unpredictable, capable of shifting from calm to dangerous chop within the space of an hour, with fog and sudden storms a routine seasonal hazard rather than a rare one. A family on an island lived entirely at the mercy of this. There was no calling ahead to check a forecast with any precision, no Coast Guard radio channel monitored around the clock the way later decades would take for granted, no way to know, when Douglas set out on the mail run, exactly what the crossing back would look like an hour later. This was the specific anxiety Eleanor had been managing, without naming it, the evening Block 1 opened on. The wind that had begun to shift in a direction she didn't like, sending her husband instead of herself to make the crossing, though neither of them discussed why in quite those terms. And weather was only half of the limitation. The other half was medical. If a child fell badly on the granite, if a fever climbed too high overnight, the nearest doctor was not a phone call away. It was a boat crossing away, weather permitting, followed by whatever road or rail connection existed on the mainland side, a sequence that, on a bad weather night, could take hours a mainland cottage family would never have to contemplate. Regional histories of Georgian Bay cottage communities are honest about this. Families who chose island life accepted a level of genuine risk that mainland cottagers did not carry in quite the same way. And every family on these islands built its rituals, the counted fires, the recognized engines, the 10-minute neighbors, at least partly in quiet answer to that risk. What did it mean to raise children, summer after summer, in a place this specifically beautiful and this specifically unprotected, and to build, out of nothing but attention and neighborliness, the only safety net the water itself was ever going to allow? What ended the specific isolation the Fenwicks had built their family rhythm around did not arrive all at once, and it did not arrive as a single wire strung under the bay. It arrived, across the 1960s and into the 1970s, as faster outboard motors that could cross to the mainland in a fraction of the time a 1950s engine required, as small, portable two-way radios that let a family reach a neighbor, or eventually a marina, without waiting for a boat to be seen and recognized, and, decades later, as the telephone and cellular signal that made the whole elaborate discipline of counted fires and recognized engines feel, to a younger generation, like something out of another century entirely. None of this happened because the old system had failed the Fenwicks. It happened because the water itself got, in practical terms, smaller. Faster boats compressed the 10-minute neighbor into a 2-minute neighbor, and eventually a device in your pocket made it possible to reach the mainland without needing a neighbor, or a fire, or a recognized engine at all. What was gained was real. Faster help in a genuine emergency, less of the low daily uncertainty Eleanor Fenwick had carried for years without naming it. What was not counted in that trade, because no one thought to count it, was the specific attentiveness the old isolation had required, and had, in its own way, rewarded. A child who no longer needed to memorize the sound of his father's motor to know he was safe did not grow up worse for it. He simply grew up without that particular fluency, the fine-grained, water-taught attentiveness to weather and engines and distant firelight that a family like the Fenwicks had once built, out of necessity, into something close to a second language. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Canadian cottage summer meant to the people who made it their yearly ritual, subscribe. There are more lakes, more islands, more campfires, more fishing trips at dawn, and more quiet nights that were the best part of someone's whole year, and were never described that way at the time, because they didn't need to be. Even if you never spent a summer on an island, this is a story about what real distance, from help, from neighbors, from anything but your own family, actually asked of the people living inside it. And if you have a memory of an island, a mailboat, a fire seen across the water at night, put it in the comments. If you spent summers on a boat access island anywhere in Canada, what's the first sound you learned to tell apart on the water? Next, we go west to the rented lakeside camps of British Columbia, where families never owned a single board of the cabin and came back anyway, the same week, for 40 years. The Fenwick's Island got a two-way marine radio in 1969. The fire ring on the granite shelf above the dock stayed exactly where it had always been. What the radio gave the Fenwicks, a voice reaching the mainland in seconds, instead of a boat crossing in an hour, a genuine and lasting improvement in the family's safety on open water. What it did not give them, a reason for a mother to stand at the edge of the rock every evening and count the fires on the neighboring islands, learning, one summer at a time, exactly who was home. Eleanor Fenwick did not know this was what she had been building all those summers. She knew it the first August her children stopped walking down to the rock at dusk, because the radio, and later the telephone, had already told them everything the fire once had to. The granite had known what to do with them. No one had thought to tell the radio to ask.